Saving the Appearances, A Study in Idolatry by Owen Barfield, 2nd edition. 10. The Evolution of Phenomena. I shall have succeeded very poorly with the opening chapters of this book if I have not succeeded in making one thing plain. It is only necessary to take the first feeble step towards a renewal of participation, that is, the bare acknowledgement in beta thinking that phenomena are collective representations, in order to see that the actual evolution of the earth we know must have been at the same time an evolution of consciousness. For consciousness is correlative to phenomenon. Any other picture we may form of evolution amounts to no more than a symbolic way of depicting changes in the unrepresented. Yet, curiously enough, as already observed, this latter kind of evolution is just what is assumed not to have taken place. We look at a fossil-bearing rock and prove how things have changed by describing the appearances which can never have appeared unless there was at the same time consciousness. We fix the date of those appearances and exclude the possibility of consciousness by measuring the radioactive content of the rock, on the footing that the behavior of the unrepresented has remained unchanged for millions of years. By treating the phenomena of nature as objects wholly extrinsic to man, with an origin and evolution of their own, independent of man's evolution and origin, and then by endeavoring to deal with these objects as astronomy deals with the celestial appearances or physics with the particles, 19th century science and 19th century speculation succeeded in imprinting on the minds and imaginations of men their picture of an evolution of idols. One result of this has been to distort very violently our conception of the evolution of human consciousness. Or rather, it has caused us virtually to deny such an evolution in the face of what must otherwise have been accepted as unmistakable evidence. For the biological picture of evolution was imprinted no less deeply than on other men's, on the minds of those scholars, etymologists, mythologists, anthropologists, who made it their business to study the human past, and it was accepted by them not as speculation or hypothesis, but as established fact. It was the given framework into which they had to fit any theory they chose to form. It was treated as part of the appearances they were setting out to save. Consequently, in their endeavors to explain the mind of early or of primitive man, they set him down, in fancy, in front of phenomena identical with their own, but with his mind tabula rasa, and supposed the origin of human consciousness to lie in his first efforts to speculate about those phenomena. In this way was evolved the doctrine of animism, according to which the fancy of primitive man had peopled nature with spirits. Now, in order that nature may be peopled with spirits, nature must first be devoid of spirit. But this caused the scholars no difficulty, because they never supposed the possibility of any other kind of nature. The development of human consciousness was thus presented as a history of alpha thinking, beginning from zero and applied always to the same phenomena, at first in the form of erroneous beliefs about them, and, as time went on, in the form of more and more correct and scientific beliefs. In short, the evolution of human consciousness was reduced to a bare history of ideas. No doubt, the history of consciousness does include the story of any number of erroneous beliefs, but the erroneous beliefs of human beings about phenomena are neither the most interesting nor the most important thing about the human beings or about the phenomena. It may be objected that what I have recounted in the last 3 chapters is itself very like a history of ideas and beliefs. This is quite true. It had to be what it was, because I wished to begin by showing how our present collective representations arose, and it is just a fact that these are determined by ideas and beliefs rather than, as is the case with participating consciousness, productive of them. At the same time, it does raise an important question. Granted that for the past 2,000 or 3,000 years, the process of evolution has consisted in the gradual ousting of participation by alpha thinking, is even the history of alpha thinking itself just a history of thought in the ordinary sense? Or can we also detect in it the subliminal working of an evolutionary process? A history of thought, as such, amounts to a dialectical or syllogistic process. The thoughts of one age arising discursively out of, challenging, and modifying the thoughts and discoveries of the previous one. Is this all we mean by the history of alpha thinking? The evidence points in the opposite direction. Many indications suggest that, in addition to the dialectical history of ideas, there are forces at work beneath the threshold of argument in the evolution even of modern consciousness. Go far enough back and it is obvious. The comparatively sudden appearance, after millennia, of static civilizations of the Oriental type, of the people or the impulse which eventually flowered in the cultures of the Aryan nations, can hardly have been due to the impact of notion on notion. And the same is true of the abrupt emergence at a certain point in history of vociferously speculative thought among the Greeks. Still more remarkable is the historically unfathered impulse of the Jewish nation to set about eliminating participation by quite other methods than those of alpha thinking. Suddenly, and as it were without warning, we are confronted by a fierce and warlike nation for whom it is a paramount moral obligation to refrain from the participatory heathen cults by which they were surrounded on all sides, for whom, moreover, precisely that moral obligation is conceived as the very foundation of the race, the very marrow of its being. We owe to the Jews the pejorative significance in the word idol. The representative images, the totemic idola, which ritually focus the participation of the surrounding Gentile nations, are either condemned by their prophets as evil or denied as unrealities, as when the psalmist sings, "Their idols are silver and gold, even the work of men's hands. They have mouths and speak not, eyes have they and see not. They have ears and hear not, noses have they and smell not. They have hands and handle not, feet have they and walk not, neither speak they through their throat." To this I shall return later. But even when we come to the last 7-leagued step in the development of our modern mechanomorphic consciousness, which occurred at a time when alpha thinking was already far advanced, we are forced to the same conclusion. Why should the scientific revolution have occurred when it did, and at no other time, although men had been busy saving the appearances by abstract hypotheses for century after century? We might be tempted to answer this question by saying that it came when alpha thinking had succeeded in developing more efficient instruments of observation, so that observation of the phenomena themselves became at last a viable and more attractive alternative to the traditional medieval practice of merely glossing Aristotle. The scientific revolution, it is often suggested, came about because men began at last to look at nature for themselves and see what happened. And we are referring to Galileo's telescope and Jupiter's moons. But this will hardly suffice. For although post-Copernican astronomy certainly was based on more and better first-hand observation than the old astronomy, yet in the case of physics, as Professor Barfield has pointed out, it was the other way about. A very long step, and a very difficult one, was taken in the final ousting of participation, when the Aristotelian and medieval doctrine that all bodies come to rest unless they are kept in motion by a mover was at last abandoned. Yet if we base our hypotheses on the behavior of the bodies we actually see in motion, this is the only conclusion we can possibly come to. The theory of impetus, which later developed into the concept of inertia, requires not observation, but the abstract geometrizing supposition, never realized in practice, at least on Earth, of bodies moving through a gravity-free, frictionless vacuum. In this case, therefore, the change of outlook, and there could hardly be a more significant one, must have been hindered rather than helped by observation. No. Although alpha thinking is itself dialectical, I do not think it can be convincingly maintained that the historical development of alpha thinking is a purely dialectical process. The evidence in such matters is naturally not of the sort that can be measured with a slide rule or broken with a hammer, but it does not require all that finesse of perception to discern behind the evolution of consciousness the operation of forces beneath its threshold. There is some internal evidence, too. Men concerned with the development of any branch of thought, if they happen also to be acutely conscious of the workings of their own minds, are sometimes surprised at the ease and the force with which ideas tending in a certain direction have come to them. They have been known to speak, not without a kind of bewilderment, of certain thoughts being in the air. The following passage from the autobiography of John Stuart Mill appears to record just such an experience. What thus impressed me was the chapter in which Bentham passed judgment on the common modes of reasoning in morals and legislation, deduced from phrases like law of nature, right reason, the moral sense, natural rectitude, and the like, and characterized them as dogmatism in disguise, imposing its sentiments upon others under cover of sounding expressions which convey no reason for the sentiment, but set up the sentiment as its own reason. The feeling rushed upon me that all previous moralists were superseded, and that here indeed was the commencement of a new era in thought. The italics are mine, but the sentiments are those of that least excitable of men, John Stuart Mill. I quote them only because of the strong feeling I had when I read them, that here, where one would most of all expect the development of thought to be simply the process of its own discourse, something else was going on underneath it. We must defer until nearer the end any consideration of what that something may be. (11) Medieval environment. When the distinction has been appreciated between 1. An imputed evolution of some wholly objective and therefore wholly unrepresented base, 2. A fancied evolution of idols, and 3. The actual evolution of phenomena, including, as that does, a correlative evolution of consciousness, we may be compelled to revise some of our ideas on the amount of time required for the process. It follows, for instance, from what was said in Chapter 5, that the period during which the phenomenal Earth has been evolving is probably much shorter than is now generally assumed. Another consequence is that evolutionary changes are not purely biological, and that they are not limited to prehistory, but can be detected even in the relatively recent period for which historical records or indications of some sort are still available to us. They include changes subtler in their nature and observable over a different timescale altogether, changes measurable by centuries rather than millennia, and by millennia rather than eons. It has already been suggested that the last of these changes occupied only the 300 or 400 years which divide our own epoch from the one which preceded the scientific revolution. For this suggestion was implied throughout in the attempt which was made in chapters 6 and 7 to trace the coming into being of our own collective representations. It is now the task of this book to demonstrate in rather more detail, if that be possible, that the men of the Middle Ages and their predecessors did indeed live in a different world from ours. The difficulties in the way of such a demonstration are very great, because, as I have pointed out, it is the very nature of our own representations that they are fixed, as a sort of idols to which all representative significance is denied, and which cannot therefore, so it is felt, have altered merely with the alteration of human consciousness. Since it is, for us, a matter of common sense, if not of definition, that phenomena are wholly independent of consciousness. The impulse to ignore or explain away any evidence to the contrary is almost irresistible. Yet, as with most inveterate prejudices, the reward of overcoming it requites the exertion. The idols are tough and hard to crack, but through the first real fissure we make in them, we find ourselves looking, how deeply, into a new world. If the 18th century botanist, looking for the first time through the old idols of Linnaeus's fixed and timeless classification into the new perspective of biological evolution, felt a sense of liberation and of light, it can have been but a candle flame compared with the first glimpse we now get of the familiar world and human history lying together, bathed in the light of the evolution of consciousness. That in a colloquial or metaphorical sense, the man of the Middle Ages lived in a different world from ours is obvious enough from the record. Half an hour spent with the illuminated manuscripts in the British Museum would be enough to convince anyone of this, even if there were no cathedrals, no mystery plays, no frescoes, no heraldry, no psychomechanics, no Virgil legend, no divine comedy still surviving. But we have here not merely to notice the fact that medieval man expressed himself in so different a manner and in such different terms from those which are natural to us, but to ask the question why he did so. Besides producing representations in perception and memory, men reproduce them in their language and art. It is, indeed, in this way that the representations become collective. Through language and traditional art, we come without effort to share in the collective representations of our own age and our own community. But where we are concerned with those of an alien or a vanished community, we cannot bring ourselves to the point of sharing them without making an unwanted effort. We have to try to experience them as vitally as if they were ours, but our own keep on getting in the way. The first obvious impression which the art and literature of the Middle Ages makes upon us is one of quaintness, that quaintness which disgusted the 18th and fascinated the 19th century. If we go farther and ask in what this quaintness consists, I think we shall find that it arises above all from their combining and, as we should say, confusing two ways of approaching phenomena, ways which we are accustomed to regarding as quite distinct from one another. These are the literal, on the one hand, and the symbolic or metaphorical on the other. In their art, for instance, they felt none of the awkwardness we do about representing invisible or spiritual events and circumstances by material means. The same human figures, costumes, artifacts, etc., could be used in the same picture or carving as literal reproductions of the physical world and as representations of a spiritual world. A farm cat would do for Elijah's fiery chariot on its way up to heaven. And look at any fresco of the Last Judgment. In the 18th and 19th centuries, men who wanted to paint or sculpt an angel, for instance, or a departed spirit, felt obliged to supply him with a special unearthly costume, often rather like a nightgown. But then there seemed nothing incongruous in using the garments of every day. Certainly in both periods, angels were often represented with wings, but this really only emphasizes the difference. For they would add wings to the ordinary human figure ordinarily attired, whereas it would clearly be aesthetically impossible and theologically a joke in bad taste to attach wings to a lounge suit. It may be suggested that there is a very simple explanation, namely that lounge suits are prosaic, whereas armor, tabards, and hose are not. But this is no explanation at all unless we can also say what we mean by prosaic, and therefore why our clothes are prosaic, whereas medieval clothes were not. If we cannot, then we are merely left with another form of the same statement. A prosaic object, in other words, is a non-representational one, and our clothes are prosaic because our minds are literal. It is very important to realize that, when it is said that the man of medieval and earlier times confused the literal and symbolical approach, what is meant is that he confused or rather combined the two states of mind which we today mean by those words. Indeed, we shall find throughout that the main difficulty that prevents us from breaking through the idols to the actuality of history, that is, to the evolution of consciousness, lies in the fact that we go on using the same words without realizing how their meanings have shifted. Thus, exceptional men did sometimes distinguish between the literal and the symbolic use of words and images before the scientific revolution. On the question of hell, for instance, John Scotus Erigena distinguished in the 9th century between the symbol and the symbolized, or the representation and the represented, emphasizing that the sufferings of hell are purely spiritual, and that they are described physically for the benefits of simple understandings. The point I am making is that precisely to those simple understandings, the physical and literal themselves were not what physical and literal are to us. Rather, the phenomena themselves carried the sort of multiple significance which we today only find in symbols. Accordingly, the issue, in a given case, between a literal and symbolical interpretation, though it could be raised, had not the same sharpness as of contradictories. Later, as the representations hardened into idols, the distinction between the two grew sharper and sharper, until in the 19th century the strain of a literal interpretation became intolerable even to simple understandings, and the notion of, for instance, a physical hell was decisively rejected as an impossible superstition. And so indeed it is if by physical we mean the idols of which our physical world today consists. Who now believes, inquired F.C. Conibert in 1910, in a God who has a right and a left hand? When the things of the physical world have become idols, then indeed the literal interpretation excludes the symbolical and vice versa. But where every thing is a representation, at least half-consciously experienced as such, there is as yet no such contradiction. For a representation experienced as such is neither literal nor symbolical, or, alternatively, it is both at the same time. Nothing is easier for us than to grasp a purely literal meaning, and if we are capable at all of grasping, in addition, a symbolical or fancy meaning, as we do in poetry, we are in no danger of confusing the one with the other. Before the scientific revolution, on the other hand, it was the concept of the merely literal that was difficult. And therefore, the writer who is referred to as Dionysius the Areopagite, and Thomas Aquinas, and others after him, emphasized the importance of using the humblest and most banal images as symbols for purely spiritual truths or beings. For only in this way could a representation be safely polarized into symbol and symbolized, into literal and metaphorical. We have seen that phenomena are experienced collectively as representations and not as idols, where there is a survival of participation. In attempting to show that, right down to the period which ended with the scientific revolution, there was such a survival, I can do no more than give a few selected indications. The reader must go elsewhere for a full and detailed account of the medieval outlook. Since participation is a way of experiencing the world in immediacy, and not a system of ideas about experience or about the world, we obviously shall not find any contemporary description of it. When we come to contemporary philosophy and theories of knowledge, we shall indeed find explicit reference to participation. But for the moment we are concerned with the ordinary man's experience, and not with what philosophers thought about that experience. Contemporary books were written, and contemporary science was expounded, for people assumed to share the collective representations of the writer, and accordingly our evidence must be sought more often in what is implied or assumed than in what is actually affirmed. We can only reconstruct the collective representations of another age obliquely. Let us make the attempt for a moment. Let us try to place ourselves inside the skin of a medieval man in the street, and imagine ourselves looking out at the world through his eyes and thinking about it, not speculating, but thinking ordinary habitual thoughts with his mind. We are not concerned with what he believed as an obligation of faith, or a point of doctrine remote from experience. We are concerned with the sort of thing he took for granted. To begin with, we will look at the sky. We do not see it as empty space, for we know very well that a vacuum is something that nature does not allow, any more than she allows bodies to fall upwards. If it is daytime, we see the air filled with light proceeding from a living sun, rather as our own flesh is filled with blood proceeding from a living heart. If it is nighttime, we do not merely see a plain, homogeneous vault pricked with separate points of light, but a regional qualitative sky from which, first of all, the different sections of the great zodiacal belt, and secondly, the planets and the moon, each of which is embedded in its own revolving crystal sphere, are raying down their complex influences upon the earth, its metals, its plants, its animals, and its men and women, including ourselves. We take it for granted that those invisible spheres are giving forth an inaudible music. The spheres, not the individual stars, as Shakespeare's Lorenzo instructed Jessica much later when the representation had already begun to turn into a vague superstition. As to the planets themselves, without being specially interested in astrology, we know very well that growing things are specially beholden to the moon, that gold and silver draw their virtue from the sun and moon respectively, copper from Venus, iron from Mars, lead from Saturn, and that our own health and temperament are joined by invisible threads to these heavenly bodies we are looking at. We probably do not spend any time thinking about these extrasensory links between ourselves and the phenomena. We merely take them for granted. We turn our eyes on the sea, and at once we are aware that we are looking at one of the four elements of which all things on earth are composed, including our own bodies. We take it for granted that these elements have invisible constituents, for, as to that part of them which is incorporated in our own bodies, we experience them inwardly as the four humors which go to make up our temperament. Today we still catch the lingering echo of this participation when Shakespeare makes Mark Antony say of Brutus, "The elements so mixed in him that nature might stand up and say to all the world, 'This was a man.'" Earth, water, air, and fire are part of ourselves, and we of them. And through them also the stars are linked with our inner being, for each constellated sign of the zodiac is specially related to one of the four elements, and each element, therefore, to three signs. A stone falls to the ground. We see it seeking the center of the earth, moved by something much more like desire than what we today call gravity. We prick our finger, and a drop of red blood appears. We look at the blood. But for the moment I will not pursue this any further. The reader who is at all acquainted with the productions of the medieval mind, its alchemy, its medicine, its herb lore, its bestiaries, and so forth, can do it better for himself. For the reader who is not so acquainted, there are the libraries. Better still, there are those inexhaustible encyclopedias in stone, the cathedral carvings. Whatever their religious or philosophical beliefs, men of the same community in the same period share a certain background picture of the world and their relation to it. In our own age, whether we believe our consciousness to be a soul ensconced in a body, like a ghost in a machine, or some inextricable psychosomatic mixture, when we think casually, we think of that consciousness as situated at some point in space, which has no special relation to the universe as a whole, and is certainly nowhere near its center. Even those who achieve the intellectual contortionism of denying that there is such a thing as consciousness feel that this denial comes from inside their own skins. Whatever it is that we ought to call our selves, our bones carry it about like porters. This was not the background picture before the scientific revolution. The background picture then was of man as a microcosm within the macrocosm. It is clear that he did not feel himself isolated by his skin from the world outside him to quite the same extent as we do. He was integrated or mortized into it, each different part of him being united to a different part of it by some invisible thread. In his relation to his environment, the man of the Middle Ages was rather less like an island, rather more like an embryo, than we are.